Hello everyone. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak to you at this conference. My name is Steph Elliot and I work for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in the north of Scotland. I am the manager for 7 nature reserves, one of which is Nigg Bay, the location of Scotland's first coastal realignment. Where is Nigg Bay? Nigg Bay is in the Highland area of Scotland, about 40 miles north of the city of Inverness. The nature reserve covers about 1,000 hectares and is internationally important for wintering birds. About 15,000 birds winter here. This talk is about a small part of the reserve, which is the location of Scotland's first coastal realignment project, which was done nearly 20 years ago in 2003. The background to this project. A report done by the RSPB in the early 2000s showed that Nigg Bay had already lost 36% of its salt marsh between 1946 and 1997, plus a further 93 hectares of intertidal mudflat was lost when an oil terminal was built in the late 1970s. We also knew that more salt marsh would be lost due to climate change induced sea level rise. Under these circumstances, where would the thousands of birds go that come to winter here, even if more habitat was lost due to climate change? Back in the late 1990s, we found some land next to the nature reserve that would be a good place to create new salt marsh. At this field, a seawall had been built in the 1950s so that the farmer could use it for cattle grazing. The wall needed constant repairs to keep the sea out, so we thought it would be better to let the sea back in. We employed an engineering consultant to model what the changes in the habitats would be if we breached the seawall, and also to ensure that there would be no negative impacts in the wider area where there is lots of industrial activity. This study also looked at the different options for coastal realignment. For example, 1 breach or 2 breach, or remove the entire wall. Following the advice from the consultants, in February 2003, 2 20-metre breaches were dug into the seawall to allow the tide to flood in and out for the first time since the 1950s. The work with the digger was a very small part of the project, with the rest of the work done by the sea and nature over the following years. Now I have given an introduction to the project, I'm going to spend the rest of the talk speaking about the ecological changes. I will cover how the vegetation changed, the colonisation by benthic invertebrates, which are food for birds, and finally, did the birds like it? Vegetation. Before the sea was let back in, we set up 60 vegetation monitoring plots across the field. These were monitored for species diversity, abundance, and assigned to vegetation communities. This graph shows how the vegetation type in the coastal realignment field changed with time. The horizontal axis is summer after breach. So S0 is before, S1 is the first growing season after the breach, and so on. Before the breach, all of the plots were pasture dominated by rush. Even in the first summer after breach, some salt marsh plants had already started to colonise. By S9, which is 2011, 56 of the 60 plots were classified as salt marsh. These maps show the location of the monitoring plots. You can see that before the breach, all the points are purple for rush pastures. And by 2011, most of the points are green, indicating salt marsh. Overall, species diversity has declined, which is what we expected, as the number of plant species tolerant to salt water is low. After 15 years, there were 11 species of salt marsh plants inside the project site. These are the same number and same species of salt marsh plants that are found in the main part of Nigg Bay. Moving on to benthic invertebrates. This is a map showing the monitoring points we used, which were mostly in the part of the coastal realignment site we expected to develop as feeding areas for birds. We focused this monitoring on 4 species which are prey for wintering birds: the Baltic tellin, mud snail, ragworm, and mud shrimps. All 4 of these species were found inside the coastal realignment site in the first winter after breach, which was good news for the birds that eat them. Baltic tellin are an important food source for red knot. They prefer to eat tellins that are 8 to 16 millimeters in size, as these give them enough energy. It is also important to have lots of small prey, as these will become the big ones in the future. This graph shows that the preferred size of prey for red knots were found in the coastal realignment site within 10 years of breaching the seawall. Finally, I will now talk about birds. Nigg Bay is part of a complex of estuaries called the Murray Firth, which regularly supports over 100,000 wintering waterbirds. This estuary complex is at the northwest limit of the winter range of many birds. It is the first and last stopover for them. It is therefore important that these birds continue to have habitats available to them in the face of climate change. During the first years of the project, many aspects of the colonisation by birds were studied intensively by a PhD student. That is too much information to cover today, so I will just talk about the basics. Before the realignment, bird use of the field was limited. In the first winter after breach, 3 species of wader used the coastal realignment site: oystercatcher, redshank, and curlew. But this increased to 12 species in the second winter, and these are the same species as the main 12 species of wader that regularly winter in Nigg Bay. Interestingly, quite a few wildfowl species also use the realignment site, with 13 of the 21 regular Nigg Bay wintering species using the site. Ducks tend to use the site as a high tide refuge, whilst geese and swans mostly use the site for extra feeding. The realignment site is used by more birds when the weather is cold and windy, on very high spring tides, or during storms. In these conditions, up to 2,000 water birds will use the realignment site for roosting. As the weather gets colder, more birds use the site. This demonstrates the importance of this coastal realignment site for wintering birds into the future. It provides a valuable roosting area when the weather is rubbish, which with climate change is only going to become more frequent. The final results of the project. This is a map from 1881, which shows the project site. The black line is the seawall built in the 1950s, and the red arrows indicate the two breaches. This is the aerial map taken in 2004, only 1 year after breach. This is the same view in 2012. And finally, the latest aerial map we have from 2018. Overall, the project created 20 hectares of new salt marsh and 5 hectares of new intertidal mudflats. If you want to know more detail about the project, you can download a report which is available on the RSPB website, and there is also a short video about the project too. Thank you everyone for listening.